This is my second video on the topic of American exceptionalism, the doctrine of American exceptionalism. And by that I mean specifically the freedom of action that America has enjoyed with regard to its actions on the world stage since the end of World War II, and the fact that they undertake foreign policy choices without consultation and sometimes in disregard to international law. I want to review the origins of that doctrine a little more carefully and talk about the emergence of the military-industrial complex and how this led to the consolidation of the entitlement of freedom of action that the U.S. experienced during the Cold War. I want to mention the lost opportunities that came with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and sadly the decision on the part of neocons in the Bush administration to pursue what I would call a Pax Americana as a way of securing American interest into the 21st century, and how that led to a true discrediting of U.S. military power. I also just want to make some suggestions about what that says as to where we can go from here. The origins of the doctrine of the U.S. exceptionalism are clear. America emerged at the end of World War II as an unrivaled economic power. The economies of Europe and Japan had been devastated, and there were really very few other contenders as far as emerging economic powers then. But the U.S. was not left as an unrivaled military power. The Soviet Union had amassed an amazing military apparatus in order to turn back the Nazi onslaught, and that stayed in place and not only protected the Soviet Union, but it also occupied large parts of Eastern Europe. So the preeminence of America as a military power to some extent was called into being as a result of the persistence of what was perceived to be the Soviet military threat. The effect of all this is that the U.S. Soviet Union to some extent never demobilized as a result of World War II, and there's enormous amounts of military spending, probably unprecedented in peacetime. In the U.S., this led to the development of a nexus of arrangements between the armed services and a variety of weapon suppliers, which came to be known as the military-industrial complex. This took no one by surprise. Dwight Eisenhower warned about this in his farewell address in 1960. But by then, it seemed as though it was a juggernaut that could not be turned around. My closest comparison, literary comparison to the military-industrial complex is from Douglas Hofstadter's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where he describes the Vogons as not actually evil, but bad-tempered and bureaucratic, officious, and callous. These are the kind of people that would destroy your planet if you got in the way of their building a hyperspace bypass. And I think that it's that kind of mindless lumbering on of the military-industrial complex. It really is the source of many of the ills we experience today. Anyway, the Cold War made things even more clear-cut in terms of American unilateralism. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction required almost instantaneous response times to the launch of nuclear ballistic missiles. Consultation was out of the question. In fact, internal constitutional provisions with regard to declarations of war, things like that, were eroded largely because there's just insufficient amount of time even to consult with legislative leaders under such circumstances. The Allies were complicit in this too. The American defense umbrella to some extent offered for them defense on the cheap. So why bother to dip into your GNP in any significant GDP in any significant way when the Americans were willing to do it for you? Also, everyone was developing their own indigenous military-industrial complexes, and they wanted a piece of the pie too. Well, the collapse of the Soviet Union really should have brought that to an end. The existential military threat no longer existed. Not only that, but the economies of Europe had, had recovered and were more than competitive with the United States, likewise with Japan. And then there was a flourishing of liberal democracies in Latin America and parts of Southeast Asia. It should have been the best of times, and it really should have been a time to really turn things around in terms of international politics. Instead, the U.S. continued defense spending at levels comparable to the Cold War. NATO expanded, I feel provocatively expanded to the former Russian border, the Soviet borders, but the border of the Russian state. And then there was this saber rattling using the schemes of missile defense systems that were largely I feel provocative, certainly not effective in any way. Never have been proven to be effective, and likely never will be. So why did this happen? What was the rationale? Well, part of it had to do with the lumbering Vogon-like juggernaut of the military-industrial complex. But I think part of it was calculated. The U.S. was no longer going to be economically dominant, and there was no existential reason for it to be a preeminent superpower with regard to military force. But no reason except perhaps the pursuit of what it felt to be its narrowly defined national interest. And I think this is really what occurred, that the Americans saw themselves in decline economically, but they had such a lead with regard to military force, maybe an unsurmountable lead, that they felt as though that was the best hand they could play. I think that was largely the mood that prevailed in the end of the Clinton administration. But it took an odd twist in the Bush administration, and that is that there were these neocon political theorists who styled themselves as sort of latter-day Machiavellian realists, and they wanted to somehow secure American interest into the 21st century, and they thought there was no better way of doing that than to establish a Pax Americana, some sort of global American political and military domain. And they saw the unopposable military force as being essential to doing this. Sadly, I think they determined that they needed a demonstration case, and the fact of the matter is that they were eager to find one, even with 9/11, and that Iraq was a likely target. And so Iraq was chosen as a test case. I don't think the motivations were entirely ill-intentioned. I think they felt as though the shock and awe of their own credulous belief in the policy of shock and awe would lead to a short war that would transform the region. It's just hard to imagine how they thought this would come about, but I think that that's what motivated them. And they thought that it would also serve to put everyone on notice, not to fuck with the Americans. It's really hard to come up with a better explanation for it. And these people considered themselves realists. That is, that they sort of knew that to make an omelet you had to break some eggs, and I think they were willing to pay that cost. Unfortunately, the people that paid that cost were hundreds of thousands, if not a million, Iraqi civilians. And so the aftermath of all this was this is just horrible war, that enormous loss of human life. Tallies are still not determined. I don't think estimates are less than several hundred thousand. Saddam Hussein was deposed, but he was largely contained, as the failed search for weapons of mass destruction indicated. It's interesting, in light of what's happening today in Libya, to realize that Saddam Hussein actually may have found himself on the chopping block, so to speak, had things played out. He would have found himself on the chopping block today had things played out. And maybe even earlier if America had refrained from its insistent support of dictatorial regimes in the Arab world, as it continues to do in Saudi Arabia. So it was a horrible outcome, and it was horrible in any measure of political realism. The regional political situation has not only become less stable, but markedly more unfriendly. So these, the Wolfowitzes and the Richard Pearls and the Dick Cheneys who thought they were securing U.S. interest have really undermined U.S. interest. We've lost standing in the world as a positive political force. It's hard to imagine how much we had to work in order to destroy the goodwill that had been generated during World War II, but we found a way to pull that off. And the irony is that the next American century that the neocons had touted lasted less than a decade. It also was just an utter discrediting of the force structures of the Cold War. And to some extent, I really think this is the advantage, sadly, the advantage of having been there and done that and failed in the Iraq War. And that is that these types of security arrangements relying on these massive forces and nuclear arsenals at home and carrier task force really have almost no bearing on the actual security threats that face the United States and its Western allies in the contemporary world. And it's just a tragic waste of money that so many resources get shoveled that way. And of course, it's even more tragic that so many innocent people get lost, lives get lost in the process. So, I mean, one of the positive aftermaths is the Iraq War should stand as a total discrediting of the use of American military force. And to some extent, it's a discrediting of security arrangements such as NATO, which continues to demonstrate, almost every day in Afghanistan that it is not the collective security arrangement that's needed in order to pursue the interest of liberal democracies in this new world. It's a relic of the Cold War, and somebody should wake it up and tell it. So I know there are efforts to reform it, but I don't think they're going to be successful. So that's it. Sort of in summary, American exceptionalism has been very, very damaging in the post-World War world. And it came about by good reasons, and to some extent it had to exist for a period of time. Its legacy is the Vogons of the military-industrial complex, and then just a long list of excess deaths and suffering that hopefully we will all be called to account for at some point in time. I want to close by addressing preemptively questions of America bashing, whether I'm really anti-American or not. The only thing I can say in that regard, or the one thing I can say in that regard that might answer the question, and that is the only thing worse than America emerging as the dominant military and economic power in the post-Cold War world would have been for some other nation to emerge as the dominant military and industrial power of the post-Cold War world. And that's really what I want to emphasize in closing, and that's the problem here has to do with the corrosive concentration of power into the hands of a single nation. We don't live in 16th century Italy, and the rules that govern the conflicts between military city-states then don't apply. We live in a highly interconnected world, and the fact of the matter is that internationalism is the new realism, and the sooner Americans start to understand that, the sooner they actually will realize that their interests really are in becoming a full participant, a full consultative participant in an international system. That's all for now. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.